Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. I'm Dina Smeltz. I'm the Vice President for Public Opinion and Foreign Policy here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The Council aims to foster a deeper understanding of global affairs, and with the DNC happening here this week and the upcoming presidential election, we're excited to offer a number of exciting programs, including a conversation with the EU and UK ambassadors to the US tomorrow, as well as programs on the election and how it intersects with the economy, immigration, and U.S. policy in the Middle East over the coming weeks. For more information about how to register for these events, you can visit the Council's website at www.globalaffairs.org, and we hope to see some of you there. Today, we are thrilled to have Kelvin Harris from the Cook County Assessor's Office, Chris Schell from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Candice Rondeau from New America, and the Council's own Lema Albaz, here to discuss the results of a survey the Council did in partnership with the New America Foundation and the Carnegie Endowment on how race, ethnicity, and age impact American views on foreign policy. Before we begin the panel discussion, I was going to show you a little bit, give you some insight into what our reports, into the meat of the report that we're going to be discussing today. I'm just going to show you a couple slides so you have an idea of what we're all discussing. So we did this study. We are grateful to New America and to Carnegie for helping us put this together. It's a comprehensive study of American public opinion on U.S. foreign policy. We build into the sample an oversample of the different racial groups in the United States so that we can say with confidence how each group views different foreign policy issues. And then we also did a series of focus groups. And so this is some of our top findings. This is a question that we ask to pretty much be a barometer for American support for international engagement in the world. And you can see each bar represents a different racial group. And what this shows is 6 in 10 white and Asian American Pacific Islanders say that the United States would be better if we took an active part in world affairs rather than stay out of world affairs. So it's 6 in 10 white and Asian, 5 in 10 Black and Hispanic Americans say the same, and compared to 4 in 10 Native Americans. And our analysis shows that cost seems to affect people's considerations on this question. In other questions, Americans of color also tend to say that the costs of maintaining the U.S. role are not necessarily worth all of the benefits that we get from it. And then the next question, again, I'm just going to go through these quickly so you have an idea of what the report shows, that there's also very big generation gaps on some questions about foreign policy. This same question about whether the United States should take an active part in world affairs has each successive generation a little less supportive. So you have 75% of the silent generation, 67% of boomers, and then about half of the other generations. And these patterns happen throughout our data. So, for example, when we asked about Ukraine, the black bar is sending additional arms and military supplies to the Ukrainian government, and the blue bar is providing economic assistance. And you see that here, again, it's the white and Asian Americans are a bit more likely to support continued assistance to Ukraine versus other groups. And then on generations, there's a bit less of a divide on some of these on generation, especially on Ukraine. But you see the silent generation just consistently being very supportive of active engagement in the United States, probably reflecting what happened in their time of critical time of growing up, and that impacts their views. we also asked about the Middle East. So Ukraine, there wasn't much of a difference on, not a very sharp difference on generational or racial attitudes, but there certainly is for the Middle East. So on this question, very large numbers say they don't know. That could be because they're uncomfortable discussing the Middle East. Could be because not that many Americans follow it very closely, but we have large numbers of don't knows, and those don't knows are highest among Black and Hispanic Americans. But more than half of Black and Hispanic Americans say they don't know. The rest tend to think that Israel has gone too far in its military action in Gaza, while whites and Asian Americans are, I'm sorry, we don't have Asian Americans in this graph, but whites are more likely to think that Israel has been justified or that it has gone too far. So they're more divided. And then finally, big differences on age here too. They are pretty dramatic on Israel. A majority of Americans from the silent generation and a plurality from the baby boomers think the Israeli military action is justified, while a plurality of younger Americans say that Israel has gone too far. So you see some pretty clear patterns across racial and age groups on some concerns, but not so much on others. And our panelists will shed light further into this report in their discussion to follow. We do have some hard copies of the report itself in the back of the room, and it's also available on our website, again, globalaffairs.org, under the research tab. And with this, I will invite out Cohen to start the discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. And welcome. Again, as Dina said, my name is Kelwin Harris. I'm the Chief Civic Engagement Officer for the Cook County Assessor's Office. Don't worry, we're not talking about property taxes today, so you're in the right room. Also, probably more pertinent, I'm an emerging leader with the Cook County Assessor's Office. Yes, it's okay to make some noise. Some people from my class are here. Only the emerging leaders can get loud today. Everybody else sort of behave yourselves. But no, it's an honor to be here with such an esteemed panel, and I get the honor to introduce them. Today we have Candace, Chris, and Lemma. We're going to talk about the council's recent survey. Again, as Dina said, there's some in the back. I do encourage you guys to read it. It's also on our website under the topic, the event here today. There's a link to it. But it's a deep dive on how race, ethnicity, and age impact Americans and American views on U.S. foreign policy. Before I begin, let's describe and introduce the bios of our panelists. We'll start out with Candace Rondeau, who are also, most importantly, in the agreement we were talking, realized she's from the South Side Chicago. So we get louder than ELs on the South Side. So I got another Chicagoan here. Candace is the Senior Director for New America's Future Frontlines program on next generation security issues, as well as the Planetary Politics Initiative. Previously, she led the Resolve Network at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She advised the Lessons Learned program at the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, and she's an expert on security issues in Russia and Ukraine. Christopher Schell is a fellow in the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment, where he leads a project that examines the impact of U.S. foreign policy on Black Americans since the end of the Cold War. His writings on the relationship between African Americans and international politics have appeared in numerous publications. And Lemma Albas is a recent research assistant for the Public Opinion and U.S. Foreign Policy team here at the Chicago Council. Prior to joining the council, she worked as a strategic foresight intern at the Middle East Institute, where she researched implications of the metaverse on the regional security of the Middle East and North Africa. We're going to start out today with a discussion with our panelists, followed by some Q&A. We will be taking Q&A directly from the audience, so you will be able to speak. Also, we have an online audience as well. We are streaming, so feel free to share comments. CCGA.live. You can also do that on your phone, CCGA.live. But again, you will, if you're in the room, have the opportunity to speak. Lastly, I'd like to remind everyone today's program is on the record. So any views expressed by speakers here today or that any speakers that we host at the council are their own, do not reflect the institutional positions of the council. And with that, guys, all those disclaimers and housekeeping, let's dive right in. So everyone here, you've read and been a part of the research for the survey. I'm just curious, what jumped out at you? I read it myself. And it's very rare, I think, that you get such a deep dive on ethnicity and age and kind of can go into the nuance in a way that it's written. I had to kind of unpack for myself kind of what are some of these generations. I don't think of the silent generation every day, but we're talking about going back to really a population that experienced even, a portion of the Great Depression, the New Deal, some of the, more historic foundation of our country, all the way to, boomers when, a lot of wealth was built from, a certain population here in the U.S. to Generation Z that, kind of the social media, Apple Watch generation, all of these different areas and entities are going to have different perspectives. And that plays out in what we've seen in the research. And of course, from race, white, Black, Asian, Native American, Hispanic, and you guys saw some of the slides that Dina shared showing some of the disparities. But I'm just curious across the board, whoever wants to kind of kick it off, what jumped out at you as kind of maybe being unique or intriguing?
I'll jump in. I think one of the things that really stuck out to me was, as you said, this generational gap between, especially I think millennials, Gen Y, and the silent generation, boomers, and me between Gen X. I think that's a reflection of two things: of lived experience, but also this real change in sort of wealth inequality in the country. The silent generation, boomers. They experienced a time of pretty strong prosperity, very widely distributed prosperity in the country. And I can certainly say from my generation forward, from Gen X forward, those disparities have become super sharp. And I think overall in the survey, what we saw was this kind of relationship between, sort of where you sit in the wealth sort of category, and then how you're thinking about the trade-offs between what the United States is spending on aid to, say, Ukraine or Israel. That was huge across the board. That gap really is there. But I think also for those who don't have much of a memory of the Cold War, Ukraine seems really abstract. The whole sort of, Russia as boogeyman seems a little bit abstract. It's hard to kind of calculate what it would mean to have a sort of nuclear standoff with Russia over Ukraine. So I think that was something that also stood out. I think the biggest takeaway for sure is that, Americans are starting to embrace the idea that the U.S. is no longer front and center, no longer the indispensable nation, and that in fact the unipolar moment is over. And now there's kind of this partisan divide, I think, that we also saw between Republicans and Democrats on what that actually means, right? If it's no longer sort of an indispensable nation, then what is our relationship with our allies? How should we be treating our adversaries? Where the Republicans have, I think, a lot more consensus, they're sort of, leaning toward isolationism, a lot less consensus on the Democratic side. And so from a sort of a base, party base perspective, Latinos, African-Americans, younger people who kind of more fall into the Democratic base, there's not agreement necessarily with the leadership of the party on things like Israel, and certainly on things like Ukraine. And I think even, the biggest piece is that Taiwan seems even more abstract, right? With the exception of Asian Americans who obviously are a little bit more fixed on it.
That's a great kind of setup. I think we'll unpack probably every area that you talked about and go a lot deeper in the conversation. So I appreciate that setup.
Definitely. So there were several slides that kind of stood out to me, but I think I'll start with the similarities between racial groups in this matter. There was one slide about the cost of maintaining the present global order. So the U.S. be more involved in world affairs, stay out of world affairs, or burden share with our allies. And what stood out to me was that there was essentially continuity amongst racial groups. So like about more than half across racial lines felt that the U.S. should share the costs with its allies of maintaining the present world order, going back to your point about assisting Ukraine or assisting Israel or climate change, so on and so forth. And I think that's interesting, especially thinking about our polarized, political environment. It seems like there's some room there where we could kind of try to find some bipartisan continuity there along the lines of understanding that Americans, I think regardless of race or even just generation, kind of see the global war on terror, the financial and material costs that had on the American people, and that there's some form of desire where not a complete pullback from the world that we sometimes hear in political rhetoric, but just an understanding of that the U.S. is not going to just take the burden on by itself. And I think that's kind of stood out in the polling as well. And then the difference is that it was highlighted earlier, but I think something that we could probably touch on later on, but it's really interesting seeing how for human rights, that kind of resonated with African Americans in a particular manner, different from, we saw with maybe white Americans.
And it depends on your position, right? You talk about, who's sort of the most vulnerable, right? How it impacts you and how it impacts your local community has a lot to do with your opinion on foreign policy. And we'll talk about some of that more. Lemma, what jumped out?
Yeah, so I think what stuck out to me the most was just how divided the American population is. I think we traditionally think of Americans as being very divided when it comes to domestic issues and more unified on a foreign policy front. But I thought it was really interesting just how divided the generations are and how specific issues matter more to certain racial demographics. And so, yeah, that's kind of what stuck out to me the most.
Well, let's jump right into one of those racial demographics. And Chris, I'm going to start with you and kind of talk about opinions regarding interventions in Gaza and support for additional aid. You've done a lot of work around looking at the African-American population and opinions overall on foreign policy. In a lot of your work and also in the survey, there's an extra checkbox for don't know enough to have an opinion for a number of different questions. And I thought that was interesting. You can kind of unpack that a little bit in and of itself. But we're finding that when you talk about support for Gaza, and Dina brought it up in a lot of the slides, that African Americans are less supportive of additional aid for Israel. And also that they were also high in the category of checking that box of, don't know enough to have an opinion. Yeah. What do you ascribe some of that to? Is it more of a focus on domestic issues and saying, hey, we need to clean up home first before, we start to try to fix the rest of the world? Or is it, some of that, shared burden again, right? We're finding that, and we had a conversation prior that, African Americans are disproportionately represented in the military. Historically, in many wars, the first to die are disproportionately dying in our community. And we've had a lot of, Black leadership, speak out about that. Even the war in Gaza, you mentioned, listen to some of your podcasts and your previous work, that there's 1,000 Black pastors that have spoken out against the war. We know that 3 African Americans were killed in Jordan in recent drone strikes that were from the U.S. From Georgia. So African Americans do bear a disproportionate burden and have more of a interest to be more cautious. But overall, what is your take on sort of the lack of engagement, if you want to put it like that?
Oh, for sure, yeah. And I think that's really interesting that in my research at the Carnegie Endowment that we also found that the level of don't knows are rather high compared to the American majority. And that was corroborated by the Chicago Council polling. So that was also really interesting to find. And I think it lends to several factors. I think there is the matter of the concern with the material conditions at home, a concern with domestic well-being. We hear about housing, we hear about employment, so on and so forth. So there is a level of, I like to use, the Maslow hierarchy of needs. So when some of your basic level of survival is not being met, then these issues that seem a bit more, I guess, just further out. Yeah, distant from your everyday conditions, you might just be like, I don't have the bandwidth to deal with that. But what I do find interesting is that for the individuals who did check off a box that kind of expresses their feelings on the conflict, many individuals felt that Israel had gone too far in their military campaign in Gaza, and that was higher than other racial groups. And I think that's fascinating. I think there we have to pull on history, where we do have, since the 60s, we have a history of African-American leaders tying the fight for civil rights domestically, but not just seeing it as civil rights, but seeing it as a fight for human rights, and tying that to what they see happening in the war in Gaza right now.
People like Paul Robeson, Dr. King,
Paul
Muhammad
Robeson.
Ali.
Even when Jesse Jackson ran for president, that was on his platform, trying to see a Palestinian state, and meeting with the, I believe, Palestinian Authority. So we see that in history, even with Black political figures who are in the mainstream body politic. And I think that kind of manifests itself contemporarily. I think what you said is interesting as well, where the war in Gaza in some degree hit the African-American community, where you had Iranian-backed militia groups where they were attacking U.S. military installations, and then it killed 3 African-Americans, all from Georgia. And the African-American press made note of that, kind of just as a reminder of, when you have a muscular foreign policy, African-Americans oftentimes pay the price. 12% of the population, 20% of the armed forces, roughly 30% of the enlisted rank. And we kind of see that in real time.
Yeah. There's also a suspicion, right? It's like, how do these conflicts harm people of color, right? You're always going to have sort of a gravitation we saw that human rights was high as it related to African-American interests and how they surveyed, but kind of an affinity towards, communities of color and nations of color, right? And a suspicion almost of, whiter nations because of the history and how are they impacting sort of the rest of the world. I say that anecdotally. I remember we'll pivot to Ukraine a bit later, but when the conflict first started, I posted one of my social media, and I'm by far no social media influencer, right? But I posted a flag of Ukraine. We stand with Ukraine, and usually I get some sort of response. But from African American friends, it was like crickets. It was, and I thought to myself, I'm like, and I didn't feel like these are people that felt like Ukraine should be harmed. But it took me some time to realize that, hey, the Black community is still processing what's going on with world affairs. And they want to know how is this going to impact us, and what's sort of the history there, because in so many cases we've unpacked these instances of conflagrations and found that, it's been more harmful to our community than we realized initially.
If I could just jump in there really quickly, also anecdotal. I remember when Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the knee-jerk reaction by many African Americans, or even just people in other Black majority nations, were, how are the Black people or the African descendant people in Ukraine faring? There was some speculation around people not being able to leave Ukraine. I guess you could say, quote unquote, racism being showed towards African people in Ukraine. So I think for many individuals, that's where the initial reaction went, where, okay, well, the Black people who are in that nation, how are they faring?
Yep, exactly. And we can broaden this conversation as it relates to support for aid for Israel to beyond the Black population. If anyone wants to sort of, chime in, we've got a lot of influencers, obviously in Chicago right now. How should they be thinking, or what should they be learning from the survey as it relates to Gaza?
Yeah, I think that's a big question is, just from a policy perspective, we have 2 candidates with very different perspectives on foreign policy. You have Kamala Harris, who's kind of a little bit more internationalist, obviously, a lot more internationalist than Donald Trump, who is clearly trying to sort of be the disruptor, right? Break with the traditional past. The implications for Israel, I think, going forward, you have, I don't know how many people have descended on the city of Chicago to show their support for the people of Palestine and, support for a ceasefire, but enough, right? But also who are in the uncommitted category. Some 600 to 700,000 people, during the primaries said, we are uncommitted until this Democratic Party takes a stance in favor of resolution and hopefully peace in favor of a 2-state solution. We haven't heard a lot from either candidate about the 2-state solution, and I think that's very telling. I think that what that means is that we're at a point at which perhaps there's an understanding in both parties that the U.S. has sort of a on what it can do to influence outcomes in the Israeli conflict. And we're already seeing that. Tony Blinken has just been to the Middle East for probably the 15th time in the last year or so, something like that. He got finally Netanyahu to agree to part of the ceasefire, but still nothing from Hamas. Long term, I think this split, which of course is also generational between younger Americans and older Americans on the question of Israel, is going to really affect Israel's chances of maintaining its stance, this sort of hostile stance and sort of this defensive position that it's found itself in on the question of this two-state solution. Ultimately, you'll see, I think, slower delivery of weapons, potentially even, the withdrawal of support for particular units. We've already seen questions come up about the IDF and its behavior on the battlefield. So those are big questions for Israel. And I do think the sun is setting on this kind of universal support for Israel long term.
Mm-hmm. And we're finding that more predominantly amongst younger generations in the research where
Absolutely.
you see
and look, we're about to see a tipping point in the electorate. 2028, the vast majority of voting population will be younger and more diverse. There'll be either people of color, or they'll be mixed, et cetera, et cetera. And the older generation is obviously going to start to shrink. And its influence on sort of our foreign policy is also going to diminish on some level. And I think that is something that, again, Israel is going to have to cope with, the Palestinians are going to have to cope with. And then, again, of course, the Democratic and Republican parties, it doesn't really matter, honestly, if you take a rhetorical isolationist stance, it's immaterial, ultimately, because the United States will always be dragged into, the resolution on Israel and Palestine. There's just a historical kind of tie there that you can't talk your way out of, basically.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Does the same hold true for Ukraine as it relates to views and continued, support for Ukraine? Because you're talking about, the same demographic or these same cohorts of younger people, I would imagine, if you extrapolate to continued support for Ukraine. But does that hold true?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll just, and I'll let the others jump in, but I'll just say on Ukraine, what we saw from the focus groups in particular was quite interesting. The message that Joe Biden has been touting, this sort of, as long as it takes, to get Ukraine moving in the right direction, to seek, to get victory, it just isn't resonating with younger folks. And it's not resonating with African Americans. It's not resonating with Latinos. And it's because they're feeling the pinch at the pump, basically. This last couple of years, we have seen inflation at the pump just outrageous. And of course, that has an effect on groceries. It has an effect on everything, everyday life. But I do think what we also heard from focus groups was sort of more support for whatever it takes. And that essentially, the kind of cautious stance that the Biden administration has taken with imposing limits on the use of weapons on the battlefield and hitting targets inside Russia ultimately is actually not nearly as popular as perhaps they thought. And I think ultimately what that might mean is that we'll see maybe a shift, hopefully, in this next administration. Otherwise, I think we're not going to really see a resolution to the conflict in the long term. One important thing to note is that the Ukrainians have now, just with the incursion in Kursk, delivered a pretty serious message about their intent to keep disrupting sort of Russia's sense of peace. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Lemma, you want to jump in on sort of the younger generation's perspectives? Or?
Yeah, sure. So I think we're seeing some of the similar trends among young Americans. They're a lot less likely to support Ukraine indefinitely and a lot less willing to endure higher costs, at the grocery stores and at gas pumps. And I think that just generally speaks to young Americans' foreign policy attitudes in general. They're a lot more cost conscious and a lot more sensitive to foreign policies that they perceive to be at a higher cost to their own standards of living, to the environment, to other countries and populations that are vulnerable in other countries. So, yeah.
No, that's helpful. Okay, we're going to keep just kind of tacking around conflicts around the world here. I'm going to kind of pivot to Taiwan. And I know that was also kind of a part of the survey. How did people feel as far as like race and generation as it relates to a potential invasion by China? What did that look like as far as generational support? Was it consistent with what you might think or what we've seen in Gaza and Ukraine, or are there some distinctions there, particularly amongst racial groups that might have a more vested interest?
Yeah, I mean, from this polling and other polling that I've also, just seen as well, we see a lot along the lines of age where questions around preparing for a new Cold War with China. We've seen that younger generations are more reticent about using that language, more reticent about trying to engage China in like a form of Cold War, some form of, economic or military warfare. And I think a lot of that could be attributed to thinking about older generations and their experience with, the Cold War with the Soviet Union. I think also just going back to just general sentiments around a muscular foreign policy and engaging in a foreign policy that's a bit adversarial. And I think that also is going to be interesting when we think about just China policy at large. And in many ways, there's a continuity between both parties and kind of this framing and thinking about how to deal with the rise of China. I think that will be quite interesting, thinking about the rising influence of the younger generation. And many may not have as much of an adversarial viewpoint of China and China's rise.
I mean, I think there was also, though, a little bit of nuance in terms of, so there were three different sort of levels of questions, right? One was, how do you feel about support to Taiwan, in the event of a confrontation with China? Across the board, I think there was strong support across the races, across, ages as well. Yes, we want to see support, right, for Taiwan, economic, military. Then the second question was, okay, well, if there is actually a confrontation, would you support a naval blockade? And there we started to see, again, the subtle shift where there was much stronger support from Asian Americans for a naval blockade, sort of maybe more skin in the game, psychologically, all kinds of different reasons. And less, of course, I think from the African American and Latino, and then, of course, younger population. And then the last is, are you prepared to go to war? And I think the answer is no. And I think, again, it's sort of like what we're seeing is this, as Chris alluded to, this legacy of the war on terror, the cost for us reputationally. I mean, there's the financial cost, but then there's the reputational cost. We have lost a lot of moral high ground as a result of those wars. And I think especially younger populations, especially, African Americans, Latinos, they really understand that because they have been sort of at the front line. They're the ones who actually go and fight those wars, right? And so that's a really big sort of takeaway is that we're willing to go only so far on Taiwan, which is a big signal also then, of course, to Europe. And there's this kind of mutual relationship between the two, between Taiwan and Ukraine, that now sets up a question about sort of the durability of NATO, right? The durability of our alliances. What does it mean if we're not willing to actually put our shoulder to it as we used to do? Then what are these commitments worth, basically?
Sure, and we'll talk about that and do a deeper dive there as well. But I'm hearing a through line here, and memory seems to come up for me. It depends on when you think about just words like even China, Russia. I mean, these are like extremely triggering to certain generations, and for others, it may not resonate as much. They may not have as much of a sort of institutional memory about these things and understand threats in the same kind of way, which probably has its advantages and disadvantages as well. Let's pivot a little bit. I'm going to go back to you, Lema, and talk a little bit about, we were talking in the prep regarding where do our opinions come from, right? Often our opinions aren't our own when we're responding to a survey. People get their news, their information from different sources. I imagine the younger generation is probably more so, social media and, news on their phone. Older generations may, still be more traditional news sources, or, it could be the New York Times or the Post or even, TV, Fox News, all those sorts of things. How does that impact public opinion? And even then when you layer on the aspect, and of course, one will be more vulnerable on social media to misinformation and disinformation. Does that play a role too? And can that be sort of, can you protect against that or factor against that in surveys like this?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I would definitely say that the one source of information plays a really large role in shaping their foreign policy views. Young Americans primarily receive their information from online and user-generated media sources, whereas older generations typically get their news from more traditional media outlets that are newspapers, television news broadcasts that are a little bit farther removed from like firsthand accounts. They definitely provide a lot more context and a greater understanding of an issue, whereas social media news, youngsters are often exposed to constant around-the-clock updates, really raw firsthand accounts, and images straight from the ground. They're scrolling through content really quickly and consuming short-form content. As a result, they're really susceptible to a lot of mis and disinformation. And I do also want to add that a lot of social media algorithms do narrow the scope of the news that they're receiving. And so I think that really does contribute to their foreign policy views. And it makes them a lot less willing to engage militarily because they've been exposed to the images and videos on the ground. But at the same time, they don't have as broad of an understanding of what's really going on in the historical context. And so, yeah, I think we see that a lot with the war in Gaza. Young Americans are a lot more critical of Israel and the United States' role in the region. And I think they feel a lot more complicit in what's going on because they're so exposed to just what's going on the ground. And as for mitigating the effects of mis and disinformation, I really think that media regulation and social media regulation can play a role in kind of mitigating that risk. So,
okay. No, that's great. And of course, that's fodder for another panel as well when you talk about where we get our information from, but that's really important. We're lining up here for questions. I got one more, and then we're gonna jump to Q&A. I promised that I would go back to kind of America's role in the world as it related to isolationism, this sense of America first. Should we go it alone, or is it sort of a shared burden? I believe in the report, 66% of Americans say the U.S. Should share the world order, but there is sort of a duplicity and lack of confidence across generations as it relates to our alliances, right? NATO, and their participation. So the dynamic is kind of sort of isolationism, multilateralism, and burden sharing. How do you guys think the U.S. or from the survey and from the data across generations sort of fare? What are some of those distinctions? And then does it jive with Washington right now? We talked in the prep also about kind of a disconnect between, surveys like this, what we're hearing from, real people and the culture in Washington as it relates to isolationism and burden sharing.
Well, I mean, being from Washington and Chicago, I can say Washington is always disconnected. It's its own little bubble, and there is disconnect there. But I think it's not out of sort of malcontent. It is genuinely engaging with kind of the comprehensiveness of policy that also everyday Americans are not doing. They're just doing their stuff. But in Washington, foreign policy is kind of a team sport, and you've got one side taking a side on questions of U.S. engagement versus another, and it's a constant everyday battle. I will say. I think what we saw from this survey that was super telling is that there's a universal understanding that America can't solve its problems on its own, right? That is to say, big planetary questions like climate change, this energy transition, even the regulation of technology that Lemon was just pointing to. It's not the United States that's going to do it all by itself. America first is actually maybe not something that actually is going to sell in today's United States, especially for younger people, and especially for, I think, people of color in this country. There's a lot of suspicion of this idea of America first. At the same time, as we just were alluding to, there is this challenge of balancing sort of relationships with allies. And the needs that they have are not necessarily needs that we have. And in particular on China, we see, for instance, Europe kind of pulled in two directions between the United States and between China economically. If we have a Donald Trump White House in 2025, that is going to become a situation where maybe those bonds start to break much faster than we would have expected. And if we have a Kamala Harris White House, okay, maybe a little bit more insulation, but the question will still be there. The question of sort of what the U.S. should be doing vis-a-vis China is always going to be there.
If I could just tack on really quickly. And I think this is interesting when we think about the term isolationism and like a return to isolationism, thinking historically, was America ever fully isolationist? Even pre-World War I, the U.S. has always had some interaction with the world, whether it was Manifest Destiny, expanding out west, or whether it was in the Monroe Doctrine dealing with the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. has always had some form of interaction in world affairs with its neighbors. I think that a lot of the question comes down to what you're getting at, Candace, is in what way are we interacting with our neighbors? And then I think, going back to what we're presented with in November, is it going to be an antagonistic relationship with our allies and partners? Will it be one where it is still friendly, but just requesting more burden sharing? So I think this is interesting, where what we've seen from the data is that there is a desire not for a complete pullback, or a desire for an antagonistic relationship, or one that's seen as transactional with our allies, but one that's more so rooted in the understanding that we have a shared North Star, shared vision, but we'll go about it in a way in which one nation is not taking on the entire burden.
That's helpful.
And if I have a chance to add, I think millennials and Gen Zers, they kind of put their own spin on internationalism. I wouldn't really call them isolationists. And, at face value, some of our data do show that young Americans are kind of pulling away from active engagement in the world. But when you really parse out the details in the data, young Americans are very internationalist. There's widespread support for participation in international agreements. They're a lot more likely to have confidence in other countries' ability to handle world problems. They are more likely to say that legal immigration to the United States should be increased and accept a wide range of immigrants. And so and in addition to that, they're a lot more likely to support policies that would aid other countries that are disproportionately vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And so I would say they place a much greater focus on multilateral diplomacy than making unilateral decisions. And like Chris and Candace were saying, kind of a burden sharing. And when you compare their attitudes to Republicans and more so those who have really favorable views of Donald Trump, so real isolationists, I think you see a great deal of daylight between their attitudes. And then they become the internationalists. So I wouldn't quite say that young Americans are straying away from global engagement, but I feel like they're definitely becoming a lot more selective about how we engage in the world.
That's super helpful. Okay, let's jump into some questions. You two have been extremely patient, so thank you. Maybe just give your name and dive right in.
My name's Kenneth Newman. I do some substitute teaching. There are no longer maps in classrooms in schools, and that to me is a tragedy. I've been very fortunate. I've traveled to 20 countries. I work in the sport of soccer, and I've also I've been involved. I'm involved in a lot of civic issues, so I'm very worldly. I've also studied World War II. So my question to this panel, and also to the organization here, how can we get more young people, especially under the age of 30, interested in knowing about the world and knowing the world in terms of maps? Because I'm a map junkie. I think having maps and knowing where countries are is really important. And a lot of young people don't know Africa from South America, from Asia, wherever. I was following the war, Russia-Ukraine. I already had maps of Ukraine and a little bit of Russia. So I was following it closely. Does this panel think that people under 30 are interested in learning about the world?
Well, hats off to you. I'm a map guy myself. I'm a city planner by background, so love maps. But that's interesting and a great question for the panel. How do we, and you can broaden it to not just maps, but how do we get young people in this next generation just more involved? Come to council events. I might start there, but this is a great place. I'm not really joking. This is a great place for to start. Candace and I were just talking about how we both growing up in Chicago knew about the council. But what else?
Yeah, I mean, listen, to your point, I think it's true that there's this disconnect on sort of just basic geography in young America, right? I mean, but also maybe even in older America. This goes to the point where, when we're thinking about the future of U.S. engagement in the world, we're really in a tricky position right now. I think, the more we lean back, the more others step forward to kind of fill the vacuum, right? And for our allies, it may be time to flip the script a little bit. For 80 years, the United States poured money, energy, political capital into supporting Europe, rebuilding it, and kind of strengthening those transatlantic ties. It may be that for that relationship to survive, Europe now needs to kind of focus on its soft power. Maybe create more cultural exchanges for young people. And I would say the same for our Asian allies and our Latin American allies. To the degree possible, we've got to create these cultural exchanges because that's actually where you get that appetite going, you get that desire to travel more, to see and engage in the world more. And absolutely, I mean, Chicago Council for me when I was a kid was like the biggest deal in the world. And I just couldn't wait to see what they were going to do next. And I think, if we can find ways to encourage that enthusiasm, not just through venues like this, but also really genuinely supporting these cultural exchanges, it's going to be critical.
I'll let everyone chime in on this one. How can we just engage more young people?
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I actually feel like I kind of want to push back on that idea that young Americans aren't as globally engaged. I feel like young Americans are the most globally engaged that they ever have. They have so many more interactions with people from different countries and they're able to, relate to people from different countries just based on social media and the vast accessibility of information from different parts of the world. And so to that, that's what I'll say to that. But at the same time, the data do show that young Americans are less interested in news about the world. And so yeah, that's kind of what I'll add is just a little bit of pushback that I do actually think they're very engaged globally.
I think some of it goes to the question about material conditions. It goes back to, just trying to provide for a lifestyle. I'm thinking about myself, history major, undergrad, only about 15 of us.
Where?
Howard University,
Respect.
Yeah. HU. But, I think about how a lot of individuals in society as well, we have a lot of emphasis on STEM and that's necessary, thinking about the clean energy transition, so on and so forth. But I think for many individuals, there's this idea of, to be able to provide for a lifestyle with increasing inflation, that going to the arts or going into humanities is not really lucrative long term. And I know that's one part of the issue, but I think, and this is probably for another conversation, we have several other questions, but I think trying to address how can we make individuals feel that they can go into careers that do prioritize learning about the world, learning about other cultures, learning about history, and not feeling like they have to probably resign themselves to a life of poverty or a life of struggle, then that can in some way try to inspire individuals to say, hey, when I go to undergrad, I'm going to major in the civics of some sort.
That's great. Maybe they'll watch this video because all of you are inspiring yourselves in your own right. So This is great. Yeah.
Hi.
Name and question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jason Gordon. I'm an incoming master's student at the University of Chicago. And I kind of wanted to follow up a bit on Lama's point on engagement with the international community. When I had seen the survey, one of the main things that surprised me was that arguably the most connected generations, being millennials and Gen Zs, were more frequent to say they didn't know enough on a certain topic. Like a majority of Gen Zers, if I remember correctly, was talking about that they didn't know enough to say whether or not Israel was justified in its actions towards Gaza. So I guess part of my question was, is this in part because of just having a lot more information that's really shallow or like a lot more firsthand accounts, or if it's more because they're more critical of what they're looking at.
I think that does play a role. I mean, there's also a lot of just general data on surveys about how we see with women, minorities, oftentimes being okay with clicking don't know. And there's also a matter of, it's not that they don't know, that they have some information, still weighing the odds, and just not feeling 100% comfortable with having a definitive answer. So I think, that could also play a role here is with the younger generations. It's not that they necessarily don't know or are completely ignorant to the issue. Like, to your point, I think you're right, that there could be that they probably have an opinion or probably still sifting through all the information. I think younger generations are just inundated with a lot more information than, older generations or anybody in our ancestral past. And that could just lead to a feeling of, not ambivalence, but I can't think of the right word I want to use here, but yeah, just a feeling of still unsure about the exact answer. And maybe, I've seen polling that maybe we could do this in another poll. If you have a follow-up, you click don't know. But if you had to say, essentially like gun to your head, I think you can still kind of like tease out an answer. And some polling has done that. I think we could probably do that in another round.
Yeah, I think some of the equivocation is also reflective of sort of just the format, right? There's only so much you can get from a 2-minute TikTok video in terms of sort of the information about a conflict like as complicated as Israel and Gaza, or even Ukraine. And as you pointed out, Lama, I think the algorithms kind of take you down this rabbit hole that you can't really get out of. And so there is kind of sort of an honesty about sort of a sense of like, well, I don't know, because honestly, the algorithms are telling me one thing or another. A distrust, if you will, in the information environment overall kind of contributes to that equivocation.
Yeah. No, I like that as a question. The question made me think there's probably a personality type out there that would never click, I don't know something, right? There's a level of confidence or even arrogance involved. So that'd be interesting to unpack. Amiel.
Well, hi, I'm Amiel Harper. So my question is, as we think about race, age in the United States, technology seems to be leveling the playing field, or at least making us, I think this is the first, Gen Z is the first generation where they're more connected to their international peers than they are their grandparents. So as we see this kind of transition and interconnectedness globally, what is the U.S.'s superpower going forward? Is it still economic? Because now you have other countries that are able to enable technology to kind of leapfrog the steps that we've made. Is it military? Is it diplomatic? As you guys think about the next 20 to 40 years of how the United States will play globally, what do you think our superpower is going forward?
Our superpower is all those things. That's what makes us a superpower. China, the United States, Russia to a lesser extent, the one thing that what makes them great powers is that they can extend themselves militarily beyond their borders, that they really dominate certain parts of the global market, that they also dominate cultural exchange, information exchange. And the United States, I think for a long time to come, is going to remain a superpower because of the ability to straddle all of those planes. But the biggest question will be on the economy. I think we're seeing now that even, despite the division between the Republicans and the Democrats, there is an acknowledgement that the current sort of neoliberal model that we've been working with, where profit is all, isn't really working. We're not able to distribute wealth in the way that we were once before. We're not able to extend ourselves beyond our borders in the way we were before. And so I think the challenge for the United States will be reckoning with that particular question, and specifically the question of deficit. We cannot discount the danger of deficit for the country. And I fear, unfortunately, that because of this great deep division between the parties, that we will continue to avoid the question. And yet, number one, for the Soviet Union, it was the tripwire. For China, it was the tripwire. And it will be for the United States as well, if we cannot reconcile the question of the deficit.
Hi, I'm Kate Turpin. My question actually dovetails off of the two questions previous. So when I see the I don't have enough information answer, and it typically comes back pretty high in surveys, my next question is always, what are the issues that people want to learn more about? So the next time they see that question, they have an opinion. Do you have a sense of which issues sort of rise to the top and which are the issues where they may be more focused on the other parts of the needs pyramid?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I'm going to try to tack on because I want to get to some of our online audience too. So I'm going to try to dovetail that question with one about climate change. So if you can anyone can sort of weave in climate change into that, and where does that kind of fit on the spectrum? The questioner said climate change usually takes a back seat, so I don't want to take a back seat here today.
Yeah, sure. I think climate change is an issue that's particularly salient amongst young Americans. And I think among other issues that they're interested in learning about include human rights. That's a really salient topic for them. And just the way that we engage internationally, I think is really interesting for young Americans.
Yeah, the other thing that came up actually that was quite interesting was that in the focus groups in particular, not enough attention on Sudan, which is a devastating war that has seen millions displaced and probably will basically feed the next wave of wars across the Sahel, and then Haiti. That was another issue that came up as well.
And I'm starting to get the 5-minute warning, so I see we have 3 questions. If we could, I'm going to try to get to all of them. Just quickly, if you could just give your name and question, and try to be as succinct as possible, guys.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Lamore, and I think now more than ever we consider ourselves global citizens, people of African descent. I'm African American. I think we are always been that because of the diaspora. I find myself in between Gen X and millennials, so I'm hybrid of sorts. But I would like to say that I think in the instance of African Americans and other people of color, there's this level of fatigue in fighting. I don't believe that we believe more or less, or better or for worse, that we should not be involved in other global issues, but we have always collectively come together to rally for so many causes and people. We're like the big brothers and sisters, but when it comes to our own issues, sometimes we don't get that same amount of support. I'm not saying that we should be petty or, go tip or tap, but I feel like there's a level of that is one of the issues where we find people clicking. I don't know. We don't not know. It's just that we kind of know that we will not be met with the same groundswell of support. And then at times you might be like, hey, then I'm going to sit this one out. So what do you think that we can do to curtail that fatigue of sorts, so we can feel that all of us collectively matter to keep the support wave going?
I told you to ask a simple question, and you promised me you would. No, this is great. I appreciate that. And we kicked off kind of talking about there just being, a reluctance, a suspicion. Not that, African Americans don't know, but, we suspect if you look at the history, there's probably a lot deeper. And we're kind of waiting to see. That might almost be a way to put it. But if anyone wants to.
Oh, well, we weren't going to take all 3?
Yeah, why don't we take all 3?
Should we take all?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead. Great idea.
Definitely, just ping me up. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Aprecia Faulkner. I run Global Strategists Association, the only organization in Chicago focused on keeping Black people engaged globally in foreign policy. We just celebrated 10 years last year. So I am excited to see this survey and kind of what it tells. And I want to talk about what it doesn't tell, because like Tiffany, somebody who worked with Black people every day around foreign policy and global affairs, there is a misconception that we're not globally engaged and that we are not into foreign policy. But there's a history there, right, that we have been historically excluded from the space. And then when Black people wanted to engage, there was a push away into all these other industries because the history of foreign policy and how it came about is rooted in racism, right? That's a whole nother story. However, the survey, like Tiffany said, talked about us not knowing. And I think that we do know, but it's the fact that we don't feel confident in our in our engagement around the world and how we're seen. So Candace mentioned, Sudan and Haiti. And every time that conversation comes up, I was here yesterday for a panel, and it instantly goes to Ukraine. It instantly goes to Gaza. And it's like, but the United Nations has said that the worst famine in the world is happening in Sudan. Why are we not talking about these? And so when things come up around Black people in the African diaspora and foreign policy, Black people do not feel seen. And so why would I tell you my true things when you're just going to ignore them anyway, right? And the industry does not allow for the nuance of the African diaspora and our contributions and also our criticisms of U.S. foreign policy. So I would love you all to tie that conversation into what she just asked. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Molly, and my question is about representation in Congress, where we're seeing a Congress that is relatively undiverse and also kind of skewed older. So does that representation in Congress and the way they approach foreign policy, is that reflective of kind of the polling that you see based on the demographics that Congress tends to fill? And how do we fix that problem so it's more representative of the American people and their actual kind of public opinion?
Okay. You guys got all that? No, I think that's kind of a good gumbo of questions to kind of make this your closing remarks as well. So we'll just kind of like go around, whatever you guys want to cherry pick and close out.
I will jump in and just say quickly, we're a little bit over time, but look, on the question of particularly how the African-American community sort of sits with the issues of internationalism. Look, it's a long history, as you just pointed out. The diaspora has not forgotten that it was a colonialist project that brought them here in the first place, and that the connection has not ended with Africa, with communities of color around the world. I think the don't know part, though, on Israel is a little bit more subtle. It's also that Hamas is not Al-Qaeda, right? And Hamas is not pointing necessarily its weapons at the United States directly. It's not as recognizable. We don't really know those names, like we did with Al-Qaeda or with ISIS. And so that's a big piece of it too, is it's a pretty remote set of circumstances. But we've always identified, I think, not universally, but there's been a strong identification with the Palestinian cause because they are people who are excluded, who are denuded of their rights, by dint of their ethnicity. It's something that we all know as African Americans very personally, right? We relate to that. On the question of Congress, I'll say this is the most diverse Congress we've had actually in history, strangely. So it's a challenge, right? It's not nearly as diverse as it should be. I think we're going to start to see again that sea change in 2028 just by dint of just the demographics. And we will see, I think, then a shift in foreign policy and our priorities moving a little bit more toward a more cooperative and more cost-conscious approach to engagement with the world.
Thank you.
All right, I'll try to be really quick. To both of your questions, I agree 100%. I even have a piece in foreign policy talking about W.E.B. Du Bois and how his foreign policy thinking, and many, you said earlier, Du Bois, Robeson, many of our internationalist-minded Black leaders, their foreign policy thinking was in many ways, if not entirely, contrary to Washington's official stance. And you end up having a situation where I feel African Americans are excluded from the foreign policy circles because most of the time our foreign policy thinking does not align with Washington's thinking. So Cold War, even Du Bois with the rise of Japan, African Americans were not as quick to hop on to Japan's big bad boogeyman. I think you even see that today where the Iraq War, African Americans weren't as quick to sign on to the global war on terror. So what I'm trying to say there is I agree with you 100%. And I think with what we have with Congress, we just saw two progressive African Americans, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, lose their seats because they came out with a foreign policy stance that was not in line with Washington's foreign policy thinking. So I think you end up having, real quickly, I want to say this last thing, NAACP sacked Du Bois, sacked Robeson because they said, we want to ensure we get domestic concessions. Obviously, when we come out with a very vocal foreign policy stance that's not on line with Washington, we're going to get sacked ourselves. And I think contemporarily, we just saw that. Two African Americans who stepped into the international arena voice a foreign policy opinion that wasn't in line with Washington got sacked. And I think you end up you're going to have a culture where African Americans are like, let me just stay away from that, or let me sign on to the Washington consensus, which is usually rare, or let me just stick to domestic issues. So to be honest, I don't have an answer, but I think we have a culture where African Americans are suspect in the foreign policy space if you do want to voice an opinion, which usually going by our history is not always in line with Washington. So I don't really have an answer. I mean, my answer is Black Alliance for Peace. You have a whole bunch of organizations who are willing to voice a politic that's doesn't align with Washington, but that's my current answer.
I think Chris and Candace said it best. Yeah. So
Excellent. Well, hey, this is obviously a hot topic and fodder for a lot of engagement today. We could probably do a part 2 right away, but this is such an exciting week in Chicago, and I know a lot of people are watching, listening to this conversation. Please do read the study. It's online, and again, some are here today. I told you these guys were brilliant. Please give them a hand. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your week in Chicago.